deals with audit and auditor related requirements. 6 points that I wanted to highlight in this. The first point is that the scope of the auditor on fraud reporting has been widened. If you remember CARO 2016, it was only frauds committed by or against the company by officers or employees of the company was what was covered. Now the word officers or employees has been taken off. So any fraud, a fraud by a customer, a fraud by an employee, by management, all kinds of frauds are covered in the ambit of reporting here. So the scope has been significantly enhanced, and the moment the auditor has either noticed it or it has been reported elsewhere in a regulatory reporting, the auditor will now need to report this back under CARO. So as an auditor, look at the internal audit reports, look at audit committee minutes, audit committee meetings, the moment they have noticed it, right? Because if I read a regulatory submission and I see a fraud of 100 was committed by a customer, which is reported to my regulator, I have noticed that fraud. I report that in CARO, and I also talk about the nature and the amount involved. So expansion in the scope of work, expansion or requirement of for the auditor to now be more aware of what's happening in the entire company. The other requirement is around reporting by frauds to the central government. You will recall that section 143.12 rule 13 to this particular section requires auditors to report frauds that they have identified during their audit to the central government. So if there are frauds which are more than 1 crore, that need to go to the central government, otherwise to the audit committee, and there is a set manner of reporting. Now, the MCA has put the onus back on the auditors to state that any frauds that were reported to the MCA in form ADT4 have to be reported under CARO, so that anyone who picks up the balance sheet and the audit report will know what were the frauds reported to the MCA. Also, a very interesting thing is if there has been a change in the auditor, then that is something also that will need to be factored in by the incoming auditor. So let us suppose that there was an auditor who was there in office till July, and that auditor had made or filed a submission in form ADT4 of a fraud. Subsequently, the auditor resigned or did not get reappointed, and a new auditor was appointed for the year ended 31st March 2021. Now, the auditor in office at 31st March 2021 has not done the reporting in form ADT4, but because the predecessor auditor has done that reporting, it's incumbent upon the current auditor to report it. So that's the small point, the fine print that I wanted to bring out here. Whistleblower mechanism, whistleblower complaints, unfortunate, but a lot of increase in the number of such instances or complaints. Now, a couple of points of note with respect to whistleblower complaints is the first thing one should keep in mind is whistleblower complaints don't relate only to financial reporting. They don't relate only to financial reporting. It could be misconduct, it could be bribery, it could be anything. What one really needs to consider is, as an auditor, have I factored in those whistleblower complaints as part of my audit procedures? Have I considered the impact of those on either the financial statements or controls? Or as part of my audit, if I need to change my auditing procedures or approach, then have I considered those appropriate? So something where the auditor needs to specifically focus on. Now, the guidance note and CARO 2020 talk about complaints received during the year. The auditor's responsibility is only for the complaints that were received during the year. But if that complaint pertained to a period of a prior year, it would still be relevant for the auditor to assess. So let's say somebody files a whistleblower complaint in the current year for a possible fraud or an unethical treatment that happened 2 years back, then that is something the auditor needs to take cognizance of in the procedures. Once again, there are companies who are not mandatorily required to have a whistleblower mechanism. For those companies, all that the auditor needs to do is assess whether there is a whistleblower mechanism that is in place, whether complaints have been received or not, and how have all of those been disposed of. So once again, it's not only for those to whom whistleblower mechanism is mandatory, but also for companies where whistleblower or vigil mechanism is not mandatory. A good way for them to enhance their level of governance in the company. The other three items were related to audit and internal audits, or rather the other two items were related to audit and internal audit. Now, in a couple of versions of CARO back in time, the auditor had to comment whether the internal audit system was commensurate with the nature and size of the company's business. That reporting requirement has found its way back in CARO 2020. If you ask me for my personal view, the view is that the MCA, the stakeholders, the governments, professionals, they are all now trying to give internal audit its due, give internal audit the real responsibility it has, and therefore make businesses, make managements wake up to the fact that they have a critical role to play. So an internal audit is actually a function that performs assurance and consulting activity with the objective to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of governance, risk management, and internal controls. So the statutory auditor should therefore, in reality, discuss the scope with the auditors, meet the auditors, understand from the statutory auditors or the internal auditors the nature of work that they do, the extent of work that they do, the kind of company that they are auditing, the business that they are auditing, and then take a measured view of this particular item. Judgmental but critical. A new clause that has been introduced this year is whether the reports of internal auditors have been considered by the statutory auditor. Once again, very important, what the guidance note now requires is that the auditor should not just read summary or annexures, they should have full access to the entire report. Typically, you will see a detailed report and an executive summary and an even smaller summary that gets placed in the audit committees. The auditor needs to have access to all the reports. Importantly, if the auditor does not get timely access, the auditor will have full freedom to go ahead and report under CARO 2020 to state that we did not receive the reports on time. In fact, the guidance note even says that the engagement letters with the stat auditors need to be modified. So all in all, from points 4 and 5, the takeaway is that the focus on the quality of internal audit, the internal audit as a function, is important. Statutory auditors will now also need to look at their findings, look at their comments on internal controls, and ensure that they don't have an impact on the audit opinion and the IFC opinion. So an additional step that the auditors will now need to have and demonstrate this as part of their file. Finally, if there is any resignation of a statutory auditor during the year, then the new auditor that has got appointed will need to report this to the MCA.